Okay, it is 2:10. I've now got a clock, which thank you very much for that, whoever's produced that. So we'll resume now. It's, as I've explained this morning, I think that there was a slight rejig of a couple of the questions that I've moved to bring them into a more logical place, I think. But anyway, just to clarify what I'm going to deal with under this next item, which was originally issue 3.4, but there are, I'm dealing here with question 3.4, which I didn't deal with earlier, and 3.10, which are both about the general approach for making allocations through neighbourhood plans. And then I'm going to deal with questions 3.11 and 3.12, which are about what the plan does say about setting requirement figures for neighbourhood areas. Okay, so there's 4 questions to go through for that. So in terms of neighbourhood plan making allocations, this is policy SP3 that we're talking about here, what it says in the various parts relating to the different levels of the settlement hierarchy. So the general approach is a positive one for neighbourhood plans to allocate sites in the urban areas, the rural service centres, and the service villages. So that's saying yes, you do it. Obviously, then they have to comply in doing that. They have to comply with strategic policies, or in general conformity with the strategic policies in the plan. So that's that general positive approach to encouraging neighbourhood plans to make allocations. That's not dependent on the requirement figures that are set for some of the neighbourhood areas in policy, well, now as modified policy SP12, which we're going to talk about in a minute. So that positive approach in SP3 applies irrespective of the figures. It's completely separate to it. Yeah, is that right?
Yes, it is. Yes.
That a neighbourhood area may have a 0 figure in policy SP12, or there's not a designated area, a neighbourhood area yet, but there may be one and it hasn't got a figure. The same principle applies. If you're one of the in that settlement hierarchy, neighbourhood plans should make or can make allocations.
That's correct. Yes.
Okay, that's fine. If we look then at the detailed wording, obviously NPPF's clear that strategic policies can be set out in local plans and joint plans. Non-strategic policies can also be in local plans, which this does, but neighbourhood plans can only, by implication, only contain non-strategic policies. It doesn't say it can contain strategic policies. But policy SP3 Part B says strategic and non-strategic sites allocated to housing and economic development through policies in this plan or neighbourhood plans. So is that a bit ambiguous? Is it implying that a neighbourhood plan can make a strategic site? I mean, it's not intended to do that, presumably.
It's certainly not intended to be ambiguous. I mean, if you would like, we could provide some additional clarity just to make clear that neighbourhood plans won't include strategic allocations. Okay,
it's not a big point. It's just really it. So perhaps more importantly, in reflecting what I think is the intention, does policy SP3 need to be modified to clarify that neighbourhood plans can allocate sites outside the settlement boundary that's defined in this plan? It's not limited to allocating sites within the settlement boundary, or is it?
It's limited to allocating sites outside the settlement boundary. So within our local plan review, we don't allocate sites within the settlement boundary because there is that presumption in favour of development. And we see neighbourhood plans following that same approach. So again, they'd be looking outside of the settlement boundaries, but we could, if you would like, provide some additional clarity in that respect.
So just to be absolutely clear, the intention is that the neighbourhood plan would only allocate a site if it was outside the settlement boundary?
Right, yes, because there's that principle in favour of development within the settlement boundaries.
Okay. So, okay, that's fine. So in terms of allowing the neighbourhood plan to designate an extension to a village or one of the service towns or whatever, it could do. It wouldn't matter though, would it, if a neighbourhood plan wanted to allocate a site within a settlement boundary? I mean, some neighbourhood plans want to, I guess, deal with that level of specificity rather than just rely on windfalls, I'd have thought. So you wouldn't want it to rule it out, would you? I can understand why you've taken the approach that in this plan. But anyway, just a thought if anyone's got an observation.
Some areas they have neighbourhood plans do allocate in kind of settlement areas, but we're very specific with our settlement boundaries, and so we do there is that assumption, you know, development is acceptable,
yeah,
and so it could come forward as windfall.
Yeah, I understand, but I'd have thought that the nature of neighbourhood planning is sometimes they want to get quite local, very neighbourhoody, and quite specific about bits of land. Just anyway, not a big point. So that's fine. But I think that what SP3 is not intending to allow is sites for neighbourhood plans to allocate sites at the smaller villages with settlement boundaries.
That's right, and that's
or elsewhere.
Yes,
so it's only in those top 3 tiers.
Absolutely, and it's kind of the same approach we've taken to the local plan. We're not allocating in those settlements below the hierarchy because they're not the most sustainable of settlements.
So that's to do so would be not in conformity with the strategic policies in this plan.
That's correct, yes.
So you want to be clear that, you know, allocate sites, but being up there on the settlement hierarchy. Okay, understood. Yep. Right. Okay, that's fine. I just want to deal with that. And then the other point I just wanted to deal with about neighbourhood plans making allocations generally before we look at the figures is you've proposed a modification to clarify that if a neighbourhood plan wishes to allocate a site for major development, it would be required to demonstrate exceptional circumstances. Yeah.
Yes.
So even those neighbourhood areas like Hungerford and Lambourne that have a figure, if to deliver that figure, they wish to allocate a major development site, they would still be required to demonstrate exceptional circumstances.
That's right.
But I guess part of the case for exceptional circumstances would already be made by the fact that you've included a figure for them to achieve. Yeah, okay. But the principle is, because of national policy, to make that allocation through a major development in the A and B, that would require them to do that. And then it also goes on to say that once an allocation has been made for major development in a neighbourhood plan, you wouldn't then have to go around that circle again at the application stage, that the neighbourhood plans establish the exceptional circumstances. Okay, fine, understood. So that's a modification that you're saying is necessary just for clarity and effectiveness. Okay, so I don't have any more questions about that general approach to allocations. And that sets the background to when we're now going to talk about setting the requirement figures for some of the areas. So does anybody wish to comment on anything there about that general before we look at the requirement figures? Yeah, Opus works.
Sorry, it's not about the requirement, it's about the approach, because we have it's going back to the points some of us made earlier. We have a situation where nothing gets allocated in the most sustainable locations. So it's not explicit enough. So you have a position where the presumption is in favour of development settlement boundaries in eastern urban area, for instance, but there are no figures given to it. There are no allocations provided, and the only detail in the local plan is potentially in relation to small sites coming forward. So what you then have, if any strategic allocations come forward in that location, you have area people such as Tilehurst Neighbourhood Plan Group or Parish Council saying it's not needed. We don't need the numbers because they've been allocated via allocations or they're covered by the small sites. We don't need any further development. So you're actually precluding the best sites from coming forward. And why that's actually so important is if you look at the Tilehurst Neighbourhood Plan Reg 14, there's only 2 potential allocations that they recognise that could come forward in the area, which are Pinson's Lane and Calcott Park. Now, if you look at their local green space designations, thus putting a green space designation to preclude development, the only 2 sites that they've picked out recreational areas are, guess what? Pinson's Lane and Calcott Park. So if a council is not explicit in terms of putting sites forward, neighbourhood plans or the public are going to make the decisions that they've made the decisions, and there are enough houses available when it's patently not the case. That's why this it is completely incorrect. It's obtuse. It's the wrong way around. You're allocating everything outside of where you should be allocated.
Sorry, is there something wrong with policy SP3 about what it says about neighbourhood plans making allocations?
Not per se. It's
positive.
It's positive, and I have no problems with that. It's the fact that because they're not explicit, because it's the presumption favour development in urban areas, they are missing the opportunity to be more explicit about where they actually want to allocate things.
What's not explicit?
The local plan's not explicit enough. If you look at the local plan, it looks at the allocations at the moment, it looks at the numbers that it's allocating, it looks at the places it's allocating it, but those allocations don't come forward in the most sustainable locations. They don't come forward in the settlement boundaries. The settlement boundaries is this presumption favour development without any actual figures, detail, numbers being attached to it, other than what is small site allocations. Now, I know that that's to allow other sites to come forward, but it won't be read that way. It won't be read that way by the locals. It won't be read that way by the politicians. It will be used to combat and to stop developments coming forward in the most sustainable locations, because that is what always happens.
I'm still struggling to understand the point that you're making about this policy approach to neighbourhood. Is the point that there's not enough allocations in certain parts there's not enough allocations in this plan? Which I fully understand.
Yes,
That's the point.
I think that it's because it's so high level in terms of
Sorry, what's so high level?
the premise that if you're in the settlement boundaries, you don't need an allocation. Essentially means that people focus on what is allocated, focus on what is going into the neighbourhood plans, not what potentially could come forward. So it's the wrong way around. Typically, you would start with your most sustainable locations and you'd allocate them. They would be in settlement boundaries. They wouldn't be outside. That's all I'm saying.
So your point here is not about neighbourhood plans making allocations. Your point is that this plan should have made allocations within settlement boundaries.
Absolutely, should be more explicit.
Finally, I got
Sorry, yes, should be more explicit in that regard.
It should be more explicit, or it should make allocations within settlement boundaries.
Well, it's be more explicit by making allocations within the settlement boundaries.
Okay, understood. Right, we'll go back to Hallam. Neighbourhood plans, the approach in the plan to SP3 to make neighbourhood plans making allocations.
Thank you, sir. I agree with your interpretation that SP3 little f is a positive approach. So non-strategic, allocated for housing and economic development through other policies in the local plan or neighbourhood plans. So that's your positive point, sir. I agree with that. My concern is, and I think it's echoed by others, is that that then can't be relied upon when it comes to housing supply matters. I can sense that you've got that point. The reason I raise that is because later on, I suspect we will talk about the Mortimer neighbourhood plan, and it's an important distinction to make that the previous housing sites allocations DPD document was the document that gave the 110 to the neighbourhood plan.
And that's why it was, so that, sorry, where was the allocation made? In the DPD or in the neighbourhood plan?
The quantum was specified in the DPD.
Yeah.
The allocation was made in the neighbourhood plan.
Okay.
What we don't have here is an equivalent to the DPD giving the number to the neighbourhood plan. So.
We're going to come on to the numbers and the implications of the zeros and what the numbers are and what the justification is shortly. So understood. And the extent to which this plan relies on neighbourhood plans, either, you know, in the areas where it does have a number and whether it makes any reliance on the neighbourhood plans that don't have a number. So yes, understood entirely. And it all comes down to an overall view about whether this plan identifies sufficient sites to meet the identified need. And if not, what more it could do to do so.
Yes, and the importance that the council give to the word minimum in SP1 or wherever it is by now, 12, yes.
Yeah, understood. So we'll come back to that. Thank you. Thatcham Town Council.
Yeah, thank you, sir. So Thatcham Town Council is just embarking on the journey towards a neighbourhood development plan. It has a very large area compared to many of the parishes of its settlement boundary. I can conceive of reasons where there might be a benefit in having an allocation within the area, particularly if it involved a change of use that would be desirable by the community, but might otherwise be challenging under the planning rules. So I'm not sure of the details, but I feel that the presumption that you don't make an allocation in these circumstances within the settlement boundary might limit some options that the community would like. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, if at a neighbourhood level, you know, the community is able to identify a site that it does wish specifically to promote and make a positive statement about it being suitable for housing, it does seem to me a legitimate role for a neighbourhood plan to identify that. So I don't see why this plan should prevent a neighbourhood plan allocating a site within a settlement boundary, even though it's, you know, I can also understand why you chose not to at this more strategic level to say, well, they can come forward as they come forward, because it would be a difficult job to systematically identify all potentially suitable sites within all the settlement boundaries. I can understand, but I mean, some plans do that. I mean, but I also understand the approach you've taken. So, okay. Right. So anything else on this aspect before we move on to the numbers side of things? Mr. Pike, your nameplate's still up, but that's, yeah, okay, it's fine. Right, thank you for that. I'll have a think about that in terms of the detail wording. But so now we come on to the approach to setting housing requirements, and this has been national policy for a while, where it expects strategic policy, so this sort of plan, to set out housing requirement for the designated neighbour areas, which reflects the overall strategy for the pattern and scale of development and any allocations. And I've grappled with this several times, and people interpret it different. Some people just interpret it as meaning, well, it reflects allocations that are made in the local plan, and therefore the figure is just the sum total of the allocations or the supply that's in that neighbourhood area in the plan, which doesn't seem to serve any purpose. I don't know really what it means, but I think what it's inviting you to do is to provide clarity at a strategic level for where a neighbourhood plan is encouraged, or it should provide some housing in addition to whatever is explicitly identified through allocations in the local plan. So that's my reading of it. It's meant to enable and encourage neighbourhood plans. So you explained that you considered that for each of the designated neighbourhood areas, of which there are 8, is it? Or 8 or 9? 8. And there could be more that come forward. Yeah, okay. And you summarise that, you say that you came up with figures based on the HELA, the site availability evidence, and the settlement hierarchy, and various details that are set out in an Annex 2, which you explained for each one. So the reasons include things like constraints, e.g. for Burfield, lack of suitable sites in the HELA, the fact that the sites are allocated already in the plan in a particular place, or because the neighbourhood authority has stated they do not wish to allocate sites. So is that, they're some of the key considerations? Yeah.
Yeah, that's right, yes.
And we've already discussed that that's all on the basis that the plan is still positive about if they wish to make allocations and they can find the suitable ones, they can do so. Fine. Okay. So let's look at let's just deal with the issue of the reliance on neighbourhood plans. In terms of those with the zero figures, nothing has been factored into the housing land supply that the council claims is identified in this plan for those areas.
So for those areas, yes, we're not given the figure. Obviously, there is some supply in that when you look at the wider supply in the district, so there's unallocated sites with planning permission, small site windfall lands, that type of thing.
But there's no reliance on a neighbourhood plan bringing forward additional allocations. So there's nothing factored in other than just the windfall process and things that are already there, fine. But for the Hungerford and Lambourne, where figures are provided, you are building those into your claimed supply
Yes, that's
Yeah,
right, yes.
That's the difference.
That's correct.
Yeah, okay, understood. So that brings us on to, well, you know, the figures, I think at one point I quoted, I think the figures are 55 and 25, aren't they? Yeah, and they are now, because of the modifications to simplify some of the strategic policies, they're now put into policy SP12. And, okay, so we've got 55 for Hungerford, approximately 55 for Hungerford and approximately 25 for Lambourne. So they're not minimum figures, they're approximate figures.
That's right, yes.
To provide flexibility.
That's correct, yes.
Okay, fine. So what is the, I mean, it's a judgment, the figure. There's not a mathematical formula that leads to 55 or 25 based on the nature of the settlement or anything like that, but it's looking at what you kind of judge to be the
It's kind of
availability of
looking at
suitable sites.
capacity, getting an idea of what is realistically available. So we've kind of used the healer as a starting point, considered that, and then made planning judgments, looking at other allocations that are coming forward in the settlements and also their placing in the settlement hierarchy.
Yeah, okay, so as we've established, the assumption is that those 80 dwellings will contribute toward meeting the district level needs. But you've proposed a modification to the reason justification of SP12 to kind of address that being something that could go wrong, I suppose, in its essence. So basically, it would say the delivery of those neighbourhood plans will be monitored by the council to ensure the housing requirement is met. And the council reserves the right to identify opportunities to address any shortfall in the Hungerford and Lambourne neighbourhood plans. If the Hungerford and Lambourne neighbourhood plans are not adopted within 2 years of the adoption of this plan. So that would be, the mechanism for that would be to say, right, we've given you 2 years from the adoption of this plan. If you haven't made the allocation now, we're going to pick it up in our review of this plan.
That's right, yes. And we can monitor that through things like the annual authority monitoring report.
Okay, understood. And finally, the proposed modification to SP12 includes the phrase, any additional sites allocated through the neighbourhood planning process will be, any additional sites allocated through the neighbourhood planning process will be in addition to sites allocated within this plan.
Yeah, what we're getting at, I think we might need to make a slight tweak to this, is that it's kind of any neighbourhood plan, so allocations that might come forward in plans other than Hungerford and Lambourne, they would be kind of in it, they've been addition to kind of sites in the housing supply. So Lambourne and Hungerford, we factor into our housing supply, but say, you know, like Mr. Pike mentioned that Thatcham are considering doing a neighbourhood plan if, you know, if they eventually decided to include allocations, and those would be kind of in addition to what we've identified in our housing supply.
Yes, I think yes, that's factually correct. I think it'd probably be clearer without making that statement then, quite honestly. Because you read that and think, well, does that mean something different? I think, yes, I think that how you've described it is clear from the way the numbers are set out. So, okay.
It's always, if you would like, make a modification just to change that, just to make clear, just delete it.
I think the way that the modified table 2 itemizes the overall housing supply is pretty clear, and it's pretty clear it includes the 55 and 25. It's also pretty clear it doesn't include any other sites that may be allocated in other neighbourhood plans. So personally, I think it's probably better not saying it in a sentence like that. But anyway, don't worry. Okay. So that's all I need to ask you about the figures. Oh no, I may as well just cover this one off while I'm at it as well, because there's also a modification to say for those areas that are not, the neighbourhood areas that are not listed in in the plan already, that the council, well, sorry, what the modification says is the council will supply a housing requirement figure to those qualifying bodies either preparing or updating a neighbourhood plan that intends to include residential allocations. So that presumably could apply to one of the areas that has a zero figure in here.
At some point, say they're doing an update if it's already adopted, or they decide, yeah, we could then provide them with a figure if they choose to include allocations. I mean, for example, we've got some neighbourhood plans where the qualifying body is chosen, they don't want to include allocations, but it might be further down the line when they're doing an update and they do, we can at that point provide them with a figure. Okay.
So it could be any of the situations where there's a neighbourhood plan already made, but they're updating it and they haven't got a figure in here, we'll give them one. It could be a newly designated neighbourhood area, or it could be one of the areas that have got a zero figure at the moment, but they decide they do want to make an allocation and they seek advice from you about how much should we make. And how would you advise them based on capacity again, essentially?
Be looking at your capacity, the healer, again, placing in settlement hierarchy, the amount of development coming forward, those types of things.
Yeah, okay. Right. Comments from anyone else on what you've heard there and the requirement figures, 0 or 55 or 25 or otherwise? Yep. Hang on.
Sorry, Seth. Thank you very much. Just to make the point that's self-evident, I guess, so apologies, but just using Pangbourne as a starting example, we've agreed it should have had housing based on its position in the settlement hierarchy, but it doesn't get any due to the flawed conclusions of the HELAR, is my case. I know the council doesn't necessarily accept that, but what the council then does accept is it also doesn't get any because the parish council isn't pursuing a neighbourhood plan. Whereas other locations which are less sustainable, so Lambourne's an example, the council's own evidence says that's less sustainable than Pangbourne, that gets not only an allocation of 60 in the local plan, it gets another 25 through a neighbourhood plan because they're proposing to pursue one. And so it doesn't seem to me that's a robust approach to planning. It's certainly not positive planning. It's basically just taking opportunities where they come. And what it's not doing is creating a sustainable pattern of development that has regard to the settlement hierarchy. And that's what policies SP1 and SP3 say the council is going to do. But it doesn't actually do that. When the rubber hits the road, it doesn't do that.
But understood about the role of this plan and it failing to do what you think it should do. But in terms of what it does say about neighbourhood plans being positive towards the making allocations, I don't suppose you've got any problem with that, but it's not, you can't rely on that. It's the same point as made elsewhere. Yeah. Okay. Bell Cornwall.
Thank you, sir. I just wanted to comment on the suggested wording in exam 22. The council reserves the right to identify opportunities. So if those neighbourhood plans in Lambourne and Hungerford don't bring forward those sites which are relied on as part of the supply, obviously that wording it gives the council the ability to step in and address that, but it in no way requires that they do so. Simple point.
Okay. Provision.
Thank you, sir. So 2 points, if I may, on the requirements at Hungerford, and then the second point about the contingency I'd like to make. Starting with the requirement for 55 at Hungerford, as I touched on this morning, obviously that's a key figure that's guiding the neighbourhood plan. Their requirement they're to plan around, at least their starting point. But when you scratch beneath the surface of the evidence, there is very little, if anything, behind the justification for that 55. What there is evidence for is a significant affordability issue in the rural areas in general, but in Hungerford in particular. Looking at the response to your preliminary questions, that was the most tangible evidence I could find of the justification for the 55 number. And that seemed to be relating to what was described as what officers felt was about right, but quite clearly based on an existing or an old allocation from the HSA DPD, so from 2017. And the comments in the response to your preliminary questions was taking into account the yet to be built out allocation That has been completed this year. So later on in the plan, actually, in the appendix to the plan itself, it notes that allocation is not being rolled forward, it's being built out. So that is the only justification. I don't believe that really is a justification for 55. And it's such an important number. And the neighbourhood plan group, quite understandably, are putting a lot of weight on it and basing their consultations. They were out for regulation 14 consultation earlier this year, looking for 55. They had options for quite a bit more than that. And they've been using the healer quite understandably. So it's not a capacity issue. There is more potentially available in and around Hungerford, all of which need extensions to from outside of the settlement boundary. And just picking up on some conversations about the healer, the conclusions on the sites, many of the sites around Hungerford, including two of interest for us at Salisbury Road, are that further information is needed, such as landscape, because sustainability or suitability is unknown. They are not ruled out. So it's a clear pointer to all of the sites around Hungerford need more information on landscape because they're all in the AONB, quite understandably. So it's not a capacity issue. The second point, if I may, just briefly on the contingency, we welcome the intention to potentially step in if the neighbourhood plans don't deliver. It takes a lot of hard work for neighbourhood plans to deliver all sorts of issues. If they do get delayed, and they can do for various reasons, it's good that there is opportunity for the local authority to step in again. What I would point out is perhaps a more positive approach would be to then, if the neighbourhood plans haven't been able to deliver the important numbers that the strategy is relying on, then a positive approach would be to open up a presumption in favour of sustainable sites to come forward, which is a position that South Oxfordshire have recently adopted for them, rather than delaying again to another 3-4 years of planning process to bring forward sites that could be sitting there waiting to come forward.
Okay, understood. I mean, yeah, right. Such a let's say, presumption in favour type policy in sustainable location, obviously, it could be used to deal with a number of different scenarios, not just the one that was about this particular aspect of a neighbourhood plan not delivering. It could be if there's not a 5-year supply, or it could be, you know, for other reasons, couldn't it? And I think it's such a fundamental, and it would be a fundamentally different element to this plan, that there's a whole load of issues that I'm plodding through, obviously, in terms of what the housing requirement is and should be, what the overall supply is and how it's made up. And if it isn't sufficient to meet the requirements, you know, thought will need to turn to how plans could be modified to deal with that. And there's lots of different ways you could potentially do it. One's through making more allocations, and I've heard already lots about the availability of suitable sites that others think there are, and there's mechanisms such as that and various other things that could be contemplated. So we'll put it on the potential list of things to think about. So thank you. Hallam Land Management.
Thank you, sir. I'll take my cue from your remarks there that you're working your way, or you're having to work your way through a whole load of issues. And I entirely understand that. I will, however, take as perhaps my starting point, Mr. Island's words yesterday, and I'll paraphrase, more would be better. The issue of the local plan being able to give a number to a neighbourhood plan at a later date, I struggle to see how that can sit alongside SP 14. SP 14 is very clear that there are no neighbourhood plan allocations to be made in Burfield, Stratford Mortimer or Tilehurst. And that is emphasised again in paragraph 635. No additional sites will be brought forward through neighbourhood plans in the eastern area. And again at 636, specifically in relation to Mortimer. In grappling with the many things that you're grappling with, sir, you may well need to visit that as a premise. in terms of if you identify a need for more housing allocations, firstly to meet SP12's minimum, or indeed to exceed that and propose a higher number. In relation to Mortimer, the answer that you were given this morning, unsurprisingly, was there's no suitable sites. And if you turn to the HELA, you will find that is generally the answer that's given. And it's generally given because of landscape reasons. And it's important to understand the conclusions that are drawn in that table, because they are based upon a 2017 landscape character assessment undertaken by Kirkham Landscape Planning on behalf of the council in relation to the formulation of that neighbourhood plan. It was asked to consider 8 sites on a comparative basis, restricted simply to that settlement, in order to allow that neighbourhood plan to make the allocation that the DPD had given them the quantum to allocate. That is a very different exercise than others that have been undertaken in different locations, because that assessment was based upon a 2003 landscape character assessment and a 1991 district-wide Newbury district at that time. That's its age. It was based on that analysis. So it is of itself work that is very long in the tooth. So to then rely upon that work as the basis of this local plan and the broad conclusion that there are no sites suitable in Mortimer is, I'm afraid, a rather flawed approach. So in your assessment of whether there are or aren't suitable opportunities, you need to have in your mind that's how that conclusion was drawn. I've probably said enough for the moment.
Okay, thank you. Understood. As again, I mean, just supposed to be clear. I mean, I'm not reaching any conclusions yet, but if I were to conclude that the plan did not identify sufficient sites to meet the requirement, I would have to then consider whether that made it unsound. And if it did, I would hand it over to the council to think about potential ways of rectifying that soundness issue. And there's lots of different ways, as I said, that potentially they could think about doing, if amongst them were deciding to make more allocations, or increasing supply on certain allocations already, or whatever else. You know, I would ask them to think about that. And, you know, those sorts of considerations obviously would be, could be taken into account. And they may be the sort of considerations I'd give a steer on. So thank you, understood. Just, you know, I'd sort of make it, that's the kind of process that would happen if I got to that point.
Yes, sir. Yes, entirely. You probably would need to hand it back to the council. I sense from what participants are saying generally, though, is that the evidence base isn't sufficiently robust in order for them to move forward from that point. They would need to go backwards in order to redo that work, potentially. That's a conclusion you will need to draw, sir.
Which opens up a whole another dimension to what I would think would be the most sensible way forward, potentially. So just, you know, but let's not preempt. As I said, I'll plod through and I'll good. Okay, thank you. Right. Is there anything else that people wish to say about the neighbourhood plan figures, the 55, the 25, or the 0 figures, or the approach to providing more? No. Okay. Yeah, sorry, I missed you.
Sorry,
Provision.
thank you. Sorry, I just wanted to check my understanding of what's been said specifically in relation to Mortimer, because we have in the draft plan, we have 6.35 that says quite clearly no additional sites will be brought forward through neighbourhood plans in the eastern area, of which Mortimer lies within. But you've just been told that if a neighbourhood plan group asks the council for a figure, the council will check the capacity of that particular location. And if it finds that there is capacity with reference to the healer, then a figure would be confirmed. So I just want to understand, is that in relation to all other areas outside the eastern area, or does that include Mortimer as well?
Want to clarify?
It's only policy SP 14 we've deleted.
Sorry?
So we've deleted SP 14. We're proposing to delete policy SP 14.
Yes. Would that remove that reference to no allocations in Burfield and Mortimer? Okay. Right. Okay. So there isn't anything. We talked about Burfield and the relationship with policy SP4 and its role, and the plan says positively about making allocations through neighbourhood plans and the role of infill development in service centres. So we've dealt with that. Mortimer is just there then along with others in the eastern area or elsewhere. It's neighbourhood plans can make allocations if they wish. Yeah, okay, understood. Thank you. Right, okay. Anything else on neighbourhood plans before we move on to the next issue, which is, as I said this morning, there's one question I didn't deal with this morning, or two. So the way I'm going to deal with this now, it's all about the settlement hierarchy and settlement boundaries. So what I'm going to do is, first of all, just look at the justification for the settlement hierarchy and, you know, the settlements that are included. Then I'm going to look at question 313, which is about the strategic approach for restricting development outside the settlement boundaries. And then finally, I'm going to look at question 3.3 in regard to that context about whether the settlement boundaries are justified. And there's some instances where some people say they're not. Okay. So in terms of the settlement hierarchy, there are 3 urban areas, 6 rural service centres, 8 services villages, and a number of smaller settlements. And as we've already discussed, different policies in the plan apply to those depending on where they are in the hierarchy. The council say that all of the settlements were reassessed during the preparation of the plan to determine the hierarchy in SP3, Table 1 and the Appendix 2. So the methodology to do that, I mean, is it used a scoring system, and it based on an audit of services and facilities, including bus and rail, convenience stores, post offices, schools, GPs, pharmacies, community centres, libraries, sport and recreation, places of worship, public houses, employment opportunities. And they were scored and ranked and, you know, assessed in a systematic way. But there was also a qualitative element to it in terms of where you place them, depending on what the sort of geography and location relationship between places and things. Okay.
That's great, yes.
Yeah, okay. Clearly, you know, different approaches can always be taken to defining a settlement hierarchy or a network, but you've adopted an approach, it's clearly set out. I don't think there's been a great deal of dispute about that, but as if anyone wishes to say anything about whether it is justified in general terms, the approach, or there's a clear anomaly in it, speak now. No, okay. So, yeah, oh, sorry, yeah. Belcon.
Thank you, sir. I did include a fair bit of detail in our reps, which I won't repeat now, but in the case of Brimpton, that's a low tier settlement, but it's not entirely remote. It's in close proximity to railway stations, and the settlement hierarchy methodology exclusively focuses on whether there are public transport facilities in the settlement, without recognising that sustainable travel is about public transport, but also active travel, walking, cycling. So there are a broader range of factors that could have been considered there.
Yes, I knew when I said it that there weren't any significant. I knew there was at least one suggestion that there was a settlement that should have been. Do you want to just comment on that then, the Brimpton, and why wasn't judged in the council's assessment as
I mean, in the round, there's limited facilities when compared to the other ones. I think we consider it's quite remote. The roads are very rural. There's not really any bus services, and we just didn't feel it had the services to be in the hierarchy.
Okay, so it's the overall package of,
Yes.
of facilities that were there. Okay. Yep.
Just to add to that, obviously, this is one of the few settlements in the eastern area that's not affected by the AWE constraint. So in my mind, it's presently in a low tier, but that factor alone could justify it moving up the settlement hierarchy if the methodology were sufficiently broad to take an approach that looks at the eastern area as a whole, and whether the relative sustainability of settlements might not be the only factor as to whether they're appropriate for development.
Okay, understood. Right. So I'm going to look at the detailed settlement boundaries in a minute, but basically the strategic, this is question 313, which is about the strategic approach of restricting development outside settlement boundaries, basically set out in SP1 and SP2, but with various sort of exceptions and exemptions in development management policy for certain types of development. But the broad approach is that residential and other development will be restricted outside the settlement boundaries. It's basically treated as countryside. And the purpose of that, which isn't an uncommon approach, is that defining settlement boundaries, which we'll look at in a minute as to how they, how they were intended to be drawn. It just provides clarity, and you can apply policies, in a consistent way, either within or without. And lots of policies in the plan are premised on whether you're inside or outside a settlement boundary. So that's all fine, and it's kind of also premised on the fact that the plan, based on those boundaries, identifies sufficient land to meet housing requirements for it to be part of an effective overall approach. Is that correct, isn't it, really? Yeah, okay. Okay, so if that were the case and you could meet needs within those settlement boundaries and on the allocations in the plan, there wouldn't be a need to have a more flexible approach, as someone suggested. It's only really if you fall down on the hurdle of it, that's a potential constraint. Okay, so again, back to the, if I were to conclude that the plan ought to somehow identify opportunities for more housing development, one of the things you could think about would be the approach to settlement boundaries and development on the edge of them or outside them or whatever else. And, but that's just, I'll say no more about it than that now. It's clear enough, the approach, as I say, but it's based on a certain premise, really, of the effectiveness of the plan overall. Okay, anyone else wish to comment on this overall strategic approach of, drawing boundaries and saying, presumption against development outside other than certain circumstances? Right, we'll start. Belle Conwell again.
Thank you, sir. I would just like to point out, it seems rather anomalous that if you're in a settlement with a settlement boundary, then you wouldn't be able to do much outside that boundary. But if you're in a settlement with no boundary, then you'd be able to undertake infill development in the countryside. So it assumes that the boundaries are correctly drawn around the full extent of a settlement, which is not always the case.
And allows infill development within the settlement boundaries?
Yes, generally supports redevelopment in the settlement.
If you didn't have a settlement boundary, you would be able to find more opportunities for infill development between small scale infill development.
Yes, if you're in a settlement that's got no boundary, then the policies as worded says infill. This is DM1, would allow for some infill.
We'll look at the detailed policy for infill development in the countryside later, but I'm not sure that's the case. But anyway, we'll come back to that. Stantec.
Thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to raise the point I raised this morning in terms of the paragraph 3 up from the Newbury and Thatcham subheading regarding to proposals to strengthen and diversify the rural economy, and generally a clarification question as to why it states that proposals will be encouraged, particularly where they're located in or adjacent to rural service centres and service villages in the identified settlement hierarchy, just in the context of para 85 of the MPPF, which references planning policies and decisions should recognise that sites to meet local business and community needs in rural areas may have to be found adjacent to or beyond existing settlements or in locations.
Okay, I think we can pick that up under the detailed development management policy. Yeah, because there's quite a lot that then, it's fleshed out for particular forms of development.
Sure.
So, yeah.
Yep.
So this is about the general approach. It's accepting that there are development management policies that allow for certain forms of development in certain locations outside the boundaries. This is the more general approach to restricting development as an overall approach. So just focus on that for now. Sorry, it's Bradwell College, isn't it? Yes, sorry. I am going to come on to the detailed boundaries later.
That's fine. I won't
Yeah.
get into that yet.
Yeah.
I just wanted to really echo what Belle Cornwall had just said about if you're in a settlement boundary, but there is buildings beyond that settlement boundary, they're not necessarily in as advantageous policy position within this local plan as if you haven't got a settlement boundary altogether. And I'm sure we'll come on to it, but it's with reference to policy DM1. And I think just touching on Bradfield College's position briefly, it has a settlement boundary which covers most of the settlement, but not all of it. Most of the college's, well, I say most, some of the college's ownership, but not all of it. And the settlement boundary is helpful to a point, but it equally restricts opportunities for it to enhance its facilities, particularly in terms of staff accommodation, because of the way these policies are formed at the moment. So it's something we'll come back to, but I just wanted to set that sort of context.
Yeah, I've read the representations and I know that we'll pick it up in a number of different ways because it's, from your point of view, it can be rectified through settlement boundary change or changes to different policies in the plan of
Exactly.
development management.
It's a number of
Understood.
ways.
So
Yeah.
we'll think about that. And I understand the position of the college and, and its position for wanting some flexibility to develop and maintain it as a facility. Makes sense.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah,
understood.
thank you.
Okay. Provision.
Thank you, sir. You might tell me that this is going to come at a later session too, but similarly to Belle Cornwall, we represent the Wasing Estate, which is a large local employer in the rural area with land in Brimpton and Aldermaston Wharf. And they rely on a workforce to come forward. And when I say workforce, that's not farm workers, that they have a wedding business, a range of different business activities. And currently their workforce needs to commute from other locations into Brimpton and Aldermaston Wharf. Making some small allocations in those settlements would be very helpful to those rural communities. It will help with the outward commuting, limiting that outward commuting and being close to where you work, providing affordable housing opportunities in those rural community areas. So maybe this isn't the right session or the right point to make that point. It is covered in our statement, but it does link to the settlement hierarchy and to policy SP3, in my view, and how that's drafted to limit or restrict development in rural areas.
But would that be, so you're talking about allowing development on the edge of smaller settlements outside the hierarchy in particular circumstances, or just generally if it meets certain criteria, or are you talking something more specific about an identified need for a rural worker or rural workers or what?
No, so rural worker need is met elsewhere. So if there's an essential worker requirement that's met elsewhere. No, I'm talking about people that work in rural areas that can't get a home in the rural area and have to commute from Newbury and Thatcham, where the majority of housing is being built. So the strategy overlooks that particular point, that 45% of the population of this borough is in the rural area. So that's the point I'm making. By by restricting and not allocating in the smaller settlements, and even actually not allowing neighbourhood plans to come forward in those settlements because they're out with the hierarchy, doesn't help in rural areas.
Okay, I've got it. So the principle is the plan should be more encouraging, positive, identify opportunities for development around the rural areas. And that can be expressed through various different ways, policies and allocations. So it's a fundamental point about the spatial strategy.
Yes,
Not being positive enough for rural development, whether it's in the A or B or other rural areas. Yeah.
In our
Understood.
view, not in line with that test in the MPPF.
Yes, Nexus.
Thank you, sir. I quite like the perfect world when local authorities set housing targets and allocations make that target. Unfortunately, it doesn't often work out like that. And a number of councils get themselves in situations where you have a land supply shortfall. We discussed yesterday the housing need and housing requirement, and this council is very clear that it wants to deliver housing and affordable housing. Local housing need may go up over the next few years. So I think the current policy is too flexible to allow for those changes. What we've experienced elsewhere, two locations, Fareham and Daventry, is where they've had a more flexible approach to policy boundaries, which actually trigger development outside of the boundary, where there is a 5-year land supply or the housing delivery test isn't being met. And that allows schemes to come forward in a policy compliant way with a degree of control from the local authority as to where development can go. And that policy can be worded as with a sort of a criteria-based policy based on settlement hierarchy.
So the advantage of such a policy would be that it would introduce an element of control that otherwise the council would not have if it didn't have a 5-year supply, for example, because it would steer or prioritise new applications coming forward and being allowed on the edge of certain settlements or in certain locations or whatever else. That's the fundamental point, yeah.
Yeah, I think so, sir. It is controlled. Of course, this plan, when it's adopted, the requirements of the new MPPF will come in force, and the land supply will be fixed to 5 years. So it has a degree of control, I suppose, in that context. But if the council want to deliver housing in line with the trajectory, they will still have a policy conflict if there's no changes made, because they will be effectively having to approve schemes that are have a policy conflict. Whereas if there's flexibility, they can work with developers and steer development to locations which can deliver housing and affordable housing.
Okay, thank you. I understand the nature of the policies, and I've come across them before and what they're intended to do. But this plan doesn't include such a policy at the moment. So plodding along after first to decide whether it's sound or not in its current form. So, Opus Works.
Much of it's already been covered, but it's more to echo your comments about edge of settlements. I mean, at the moment, the policies are quite restrictive. So if you go outside of your main urban areas, you can be a metre outside and all of a sudden you're in the countryside. So you're less sustainable than a service village. So, building 30 houses on the edge of, say, Newbury is considerably more sustainable than building something in a service village which has less of those facilities and amenities. So I think that a more flexible policy allows for edge of settlement development, certainly in the urban areas, would make common sense.
Well, some say more development in rural areas is what you need to achieve sustainable development, and some say it's on the edge of Newbury. So there we go. Hallam again.
Thank you, sir. I can be brief because Mr. Tunstall has said to a great extent what I was going to say, but I'm going to come at it from a slightly different point of view, in that the wording that was given yesterday to pray in aid soundness of the plan is that the strategic requirement will be a minimum. So the type of policy that is being referred to, a policy that would permit development within or immediately adjacent to a settlement boundary or well related to a settlement boundary, has a positive role in the context of ensuring that the housing requirement is exceeded. The minimum is met and exceeded, because it avoids those situations where you are either within or outside the settlement boundary, and depending on which side of the line you're at, depending on the policy that apply. It allows for a greater degree of consideration of the merits of a location in that instance.
Okay, thank you. So yes, understood. I think we've explored that. The choice is you have a settlement boundary, then you have a black and white approach to allowing development outside it, or you have a more positive approach or more positive approach in certain circumstances or whatever. Understood. So if we get there, we can think about those options. So moving on then to the actual settlement boundaries. Time is it now? I'm going to look now. I think maybe we'll have a break for 15 minutes before we move on to this. And then I think what I might do after that is deal with the site selection methodology and leave 3.6 and 3.7 till later, because I think they're quite discrete and narrower. So let's break now and come back at 25 past, and then we'll move on to looking at these settlement boundaries, and then we'll look at site selection methodology. Okay. Okay, so it's 3:25, so we'll resume. Just a reminder, we are needing to finish here at 4:45 or 4:50 at the very latest, I think. So we will deal now with settlement boundaries. So the settlement boundary background paper describes the approach taken to defining the boundaries in the plan. And Appendix 2 summarises the approach, including what land and buildings to include and what to exclude, along with some other specific issues that had to be assessed on a case-by-case basis. So and it was a systematic and sort of overall approach that was taken to all the settlements to look at the boundaries using those criteria. And you end up with, as they are now defined on the policies map. You've seen that there are some suggestions. Well, there's two categories of suggestions, I think. There's one, that the whole approach to defining the boundaries is wrong. They should have been more loosely drawn to allow for, suitable sites to come forward on the edge of settlement. So that's a kind of strategic point. And there's also a whole issue about, well, a strategic approach for outside the boundaries, which we've talked about. So on the issue of you should have had an approach which was a much more looser boundary that was more generous in allowing for windfall developments on the edge of that wasn't the purpose of the approach, was it? It was to be more clear, to be clearer than that. It was to tightly define the existing built form and say infill development within, okay, but not edge of settlement development. That's
Yes, that was the basic approach. Yes, that's right.
okay. So there's various statements and representations that are saying there's areas that are suitable for development that should have been included within settlement boundary. So I treat those as omission sites. I don't want to discuss those today, but there are a limited number of ones where I think in effect that the argument is that the approach has been misapplied in detail, which I'll come on to those in a minute. Just before I name those and go through each in turn, you have proposed in your statement a modification to the Newbury settlement boundary at Sandalford Park to reflect the area that's got planning permission. Is that correct?
That is correct, yes.
And you included a map as Appendix 1, which I've got here. And I think the statement refers to two modifications to the Newbury settlement boundary, west of Newbury College and south of Crooks Copse. Yep.
Yes, so there's actually two. There was a change to the site boundary of Sandalford, and then there was a separate settlement boundary change.
Let me just clarify what the settlement boundary change is. So in the map, I've got it before me. It's got a broken black line and an unbroken black line. And on the legend is the black line around Crooks Copse. Have you got the picture there? Yeah, there's the black line that's around Crooks Copse, which is a green shaded area, and a white area just below it. Yeah,
that's right.
That was excluded from the settlement boundary in the submitted plan.
Yes.
But now it's brought into the settlement boundary.
Yes.
And that reflects the planning permission. Yeah.
Yes.
So is that one area or is that two?
Yes. No, that's the one area.
So where is there another area that's changed or not?
No, not for the settlement boundary.
No. Okay, fine. Okay, understood. So that's clear enough. Yeah. Thank you. So the general strategic point about the suggestions that you should have drawn boundaries looser, I've dealt with that. I don't really want to deal with that because that's not what was done. So I'm going to look at where, in effect, some of the objections query the application, I think, of the approach in particular circumstances. One's at Cheveley. Now that's a representor who put a statement in that isn't here, but I'll just go through it quickly anyway. The other one, Bradfield College, I'll deal with in terms of the settlement boundary issue. We'll come back to the policy approach to development in such establishments later as well. Another one is at Pinson's Lane Retail Park. And finally, the designated employment area east of Thatcham. So I think they're ones, so I'll just go through each of those in turn. The one at Cheveley basically brings the boundary in at Morfitts Lane. This the explanation has been set out in the background paper and appendix as a table. It lists the reasons for the changes or not making changes in each case. But the question here, I think, is the representor says the boundary has been moved to be tighter, and there is land that contains a garage and a workshop, camping equipment, storage, and it's contained by houses and tall conifer henches. So I think the point being that, well, actually that falls within the category of what should be included within the settlement boundary according to the methodology. And it's been quite different from the other land outside the new settlement boundary, which is more rural in nature. So is there anything you can add in terms of the explanation? And there seemed to be some issue about a planning permission that having lapsed, and that may be the reason why the council's changed it. Is that significant or not?
The planning application is an unrelated issue. So with regards to this, I think it's the settlement boundary review background paper makes it very clear that it was an on-balance decision. We took a decision to go with the community viewpoint on this one. And
Sorry, what's the community?
well, basically we had a request from the local member, basically as set out in the settlement boundary review background paper. So we had a request from the local member, and we made clear, we looked at it again, and we made clear that actually we could redraw the boundary. It was a case of it, the whole area could be in or out. It was, as I say, it was an on-balance decision. Since then, we have, in the correspondence that we've received from or been copied in on from Cheveley Parish Council, it's been made clear that the Parish Council did not support the revision. So if the inspector concluded that the area should stay in, then the council would be happy to propose a modification to that effect.
So, okay, right. So the boundary was defined in the DPD. Circumstances hadn't changed significantly. This planning permission is a red herring. It's nothing to do with that. No, and the boundary wasn't drawn to reflect a planning permission. No, it was just about the physical characteristics of the land, and you were trying to satisfy in applying the criteria. You could have gone either way. It was a balanced judgment, and you were trying to please the local the local viewpoint. And so you're happy to, if the parish council now have said that they are happy to revert back to the existing boundary, you'd be happy to.
Yes,
to
we
go along
would.
with that.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you for that one. That's helpful. I mean, it's not a strong soundness issue, but I mean, it's a matter of justification, and I'll have a think about that one. Okay, let me now look at Bradfield College, and as I say, we're just going to look at the extent to which the settlement boundary, leaving aside the policy issues and about what the plan should do to encourage the development needed to support these facilities. Can we just think about whether the settlement boundary here is consistent with the methodology or not? I've got a map which shows the settlement boundary in an area that isn't included within it. Did you provide the map, or did I get that from the policy? I can't remember now.
I provided a map within my hearing statement. Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I'm looking at. I think so. It's got a red line.
Yes, I think the red line's probably mine. Yeah.
Yeah.
There were some modifications that the council have proposed, which are more modest in nature and just taking some existing buildings around the crossroads.
So the red line on this map is the extent of the college land holdings, or where you suggest the settlement boundary should be?
Just where the settlement boundary should be. The ownership of the college is far more extensive, but it's covering a lot of playing fields and what have you that clearly wouldn't be appropriate within the settlement boundary.
Leaving aside the desire to, the policy position on a purely applying the council's criteria, is your argument that that red line would comply with the criteria, i.e. the types of land and buildings that should be included within the settlement boundary? Is that your argument? Or
Yeah,
is it-
broadly, yes. I mean, it would be for the council to perhaps refine that boundary if they wish to do so. I've shown the area where there is additional development which could be incorporated into the settlement boundary, particularly the housing that's along a road to the south of the village there. There's around a dozen houses there, which are all within the college ownership. They're all staff accommodation. They're well established. Some been there for 50 odd years. But there's a number of them that would lend themselves to redevelopment and bringing forwards perhaps additional dwellings as part of that. So there's some very large timber properties there that are quite honestly within 10 years of the end of their life. It would make far more sense to redevelop that for perhaps 2 or 3 units, increasing the staff provision there, making better use of the land without having to go out into the open countryside as such. What I'd just like to make clear is the college isn't looking necessarily to massively increase the amount of staff accommodation that it has. The problem it has is more the mix of housing that it has. It has about 50% of its current staff accommodation, of which it's got about 100 units there, is 1 beds and some 2 beds. Gone are the days where the teaching staff who came to live at the college were bachelors or single people that just needed a 1-bed studio flat. Usually they are coming as families or at least couples, and they need larger accommodation. They simply don't have enough of that. And so it's really looking for some flexibility there, because clearly if they've got 1-bed studio flats in the heart of the college, they can't redevelop that and produce a 3 or 4 bedroom house. So it's giving some flexibility and loosening those boundaries where there is established development, and there could be an opportunity to just intensify that and allow for some net loss, if you like, some loss of 1-bed units within the heart of the village and replaced with larger units. So it balances out.
Okay.
And meets needs.
Forgive me, we're going to come back to, there's 2 separate issues in my mind. One is the strategic approach and the application of the methodology to the particular circumstances and whether this is, and in sort of separate to that is the whole approach to the plans facilitating development needed at institutions such as this that are in the countryside, irrespective of where the settlement boundary is. So it's 2 separate things, or 2 ways I can understand the need that, for the college here, and I'm sure lots of other educational institutions that may need that sort of approach or flexibility. So just I'll turn to the council on this one then, in terms of where the boundary is drawn at Bradfield and the college, and that you've seen the red line suggested by Lucy White. Is your view that you'd maintain that the boundary correctly applies the methodology at the moment?
That's right, it does.
So the fact that there are these buildings outside the boundary, there's quite a lot of instances like that around the district, but it's quite clear that sort of the approach in the methodology to where the boundary lines are drawn.
That's right,
Yeah.
yes.
So, okay, understood. So for that reason, you would say the settlement boundary is justified.
Yes.
Shall we then leave the issue about the plan's approach to facilitating development in relation to institutions like this to the Matter 11, where it's on the agenda for that? Because there's different ways you could deal with it, isn't there, irrespective of the settlement boundary? Yeah.
Yes.
Is that okay? Is that okay?
Yes, I'm happy with that. I think we just need to explore it because clearly as things stand, it's the settlement boundary is very restrictive, and once you are beyond it, it seems, you know, it shutters down to
So
development.
there's two different ways you could deal with that. You could change the settlement boundary to facilitate
Exactly.
development.
Yes.
Or you could
change
allocate the site for a particular, you could allocate the site and subject to criteria allow development, irrespective of where the settlement boundary is. Or you could have a criteria-based approach for these sort of establishments in the countryside, whether irrespective of where the settlement boundary is, and etc. So let's explore that when we come back under matter 11, rather
Thank you.
than looking at the application of the methodology here. Right, so that's covered that one off. Pinson's Lane Retail Park falls outside Thiel settlement boundary and is it Reading? What's the other one, the other side of the motorway? I don't know. I can't. Tilehurst settlement boundary. Yes, of course it's Tilehurst. And outside the settlement boundary, filling some of the gap between those two, that outside those two settlement boundaries, filling some of the gap between them, is this large retail park, which is designated as a employment area, but falls outside both of the settlement boundaries. So again, are the settlement boundaries correctly drawn based on the methodology and irrespective of that development that falls outside them?
They count, yes, they are.
Because
they follow clearly defined boundaries. So the boundary goes along the edge of the A4 Bath Road, and then it follows a footpath to the east of the existing development. That clearly follows the existing built-up area.
So Tilehurst and Thiel, I mean, as a consequence of this approach, it kind of provides a bit of countryside in terms of what the plan policies apply between the two.
It does, yes.
But that's not particularly because there's a sort of settlement gap approach. It's just that they are the settlement boundaries. They happen to be close, but they are separate.
That's right, yes.
Okay, fine. And what does the methodology say about the existence of retail parks such as this being outside? Is that a general? So we come on to the designated employment area on the eastern side of Thatcham as well, but someone else has pointed out, well, why is that excluded from the settlement boundary when it's a designated employment area? So maybe you could deal with both those two things in the same principle apply, presumably.
Yes, so areas such as this, the settlement boundary review criteria make clear that there are specific issues that will be considered on a site-by-site basis. And it says employment and leisure uses located on the edge of settlements will be considered according to their scale, functionality and physical relationship to the settlement.
So in the case of this big retail park next to the motorway junction and outside the two settlement boundaries, you say it doesn't have a strong physical functional relationship with settlements. It has a strong physical relationship with the motorway and the busy roads that serve it.
So at the moment, there's a clear separation between the existing built form and the retail park.
Okay. Whereas the representations say that it was inconceivable that any visitor would not perceive the retail park as part of the Reading urban area rather than countryside. But your view is that it doesn't have a clear physical relationship.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, okay, thank you. And I'll come back to Pinson's Lane, I don't want to say something, but and the same would apply to this designated employment area on the eastern edge of Thatcham. Is that the same reason?
That was the same reason, yes.
Okay, thank you. So any comments from others about the application of the methodology to the settlement boundaries, either ones that I've already referred to, or if I've missed any that you think is falls into this category? Yes, okay. Vincent's Lane.
Thank you very much, sir. So focusing on the settlement boundary document and looking at, there's a list of what the boundaries will include. I can't give you a page number because I don't think the document has a page number, but it's, I'm looking at.
I've got a list in Appendix 2 of the plan. So it says boundaries will exclude.
Yes.
Boundaries will include. Yeah.
That's it,
Yeah.
that's it,
Yeah.
that's it. So first of all, yes, we are focused on the retail park, but, and I'm hoping you're going to go out and have a look at this to form your own judgment. You'll see that
sort of site visit, that one.
There's a nice recreation ground that you can go and have a look at. And you can also, there's a public footpath there through my site. And really what I'm saying is that the recreation open space should be included, because that's one of the things that they say they will include, which for some reason they haven't included. You've got the point about the area we say is effectively read as part of the urban area. And you've also got the point that on a site-by-site basis, they say specific issues will be considered. And they've singled out, amongst other things, employment and leisure uses located on the edge of settlements, which they say will be considered according to their scale and functionality. And I take that to mean that the smaller you are, the less significant you are, and that the bigger you are, that the more you ought to be within the settlement. And it seems inconceivable to us that applying their own rules, they have not included those areas in the settlement boundary. And I'm being a very good girl and not talking to you about till 13.
No, understood. Okay, right. Yeah, Colthrop Consortium. This is about the designate. This is the Thatcham one, is it?
Yes, thank you. So my client made the representations regarding the employment land to the east of Thatcham. And our point that it seems rather odd that this very large employment area, and you only have to look at it on Google Earth to see the exact extent of that area, why that is not included within the settlement boundary. I'm not just talking about the extent of that area in terms of previously developed land and buildings, but also its relationship with Thatcham in terms of being immediately adjoining to the east, significant areas of residential development, its proximity to the railway station, it's immediately next to the canal, etc. So I think you asked the council if the reasons why this had been excluded were the same as the Pinsons Lane retail park, if it's retail park, sorry. And I think the council said they were the same, but I'm failing to understand why that's the case when you look at this, like I say, significant employment area, which we consider to be within Thatcham.
Okay, so yeah, understood. Right, Thatcham Town Council.
So different and technical point, just a correction. If you'd want to go through the matters of substance first, I'll complete this. Okay, thank you. So my point is on our Reg 9 representations, page 77, where we identify an inconsistency between the conclusions in the settlement boundary review and the map. So that's the difference between page 115, which states that an area between Tullway and Sowerby Street should be outside of the settlement boundary, and the map on PDF page 76, which shows it included. So we just need to make sure that the policies map reflects the conclusions and not the map and not the drawing in the settlement boundary. It's an inconsistency within that document. And I assume that the written text of the council's opinion is what should take precedence over the map, which is attempt to represent it. Thank you.
Sorry, did the council get that?
Could you just repeat that?
So on page 115, the conclusion of our comments is that the council does consider that the open space to the north and west of Sowerby Street and east of Tollway should be excluded from the settlement boundary. That is, east of Tollway and west of Sowerby Street should be excluded from the settlement boundary, but the map in the same document shows it included. And I'm assuming that the text, which is the explicit conclusion of the council, should take precedence over the map.
I think the easiest way to deal with this, I think, will be, could you talk to the council or send them a note just to clarify what it is, and I'll ask them to just have a look at it.
Thank you.
See, and as far as what's shown on the policies map.
Well, unfortunately, it's sufficiently small. I can only see it on the online map, which is not functioning because it's not showing the base map at the moment. So I need to check that before telling them, but I believe it was the problem is that the policies map can be updated according to the map in the document. We just need to make sure that it's the text that is reversed. So, yeah.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Bucklebury Parish Council.
Thank you, sir. Just to go through, obviously, we raised a point about the difference in the settlement boundary.
Sorry, I meant to say about this. Can we deal with the way that the settlement boundary is drawn at the North East Thatcham allocation under that ish matter?
Yes.
Yeah, because I want to deal with it there, and you'll have seen there's been a proposed modification.
I have, yeah. And I was going to come on to that proposed modification as well.
But can we do it under North East Thatcham? Because I think it's specific to that site, isn't it?
We certainly can. There was one other point,
yeah,
though,
sure.
that just in terms of that, and maybe you want to take this also as part of North East Thatcham. When you look at policy SP1, and it talks around, this is in Newbury and Thatcham, and right at the end, it talks about the villages and the surrounding area will retain their existing role and separate identity with settlement boundaries. Policy SP8, DM1 and DM2. This is a DM2 point. I know this was on your agenda today. Do you want me to hold it?
It's on the agenda another time, isn't it?
No,
is it? Sorry, DM2, sorry. Yeah.
You have flagged it today to talk about whether you want me to hold that or talk about it now.
It is on the agenda for today, but not under this item. The
Yeah.
separation of settlements, yeah.
But this is kind of on a settlement boundary into separation of settlements. But I'm happy to hold it and come back to it.
Hold it for now. We'll come back to that because the specific policy DM2 I was going to talk about. Yeah, thank you. Hopefully it'll be today. If not, we will have a specific time when we will talk about it. Okay. Thank you very much. Provision.
Thank you, sir. Just to draw attention to our representations and the point we've made about map 30, the settlement boundary south of Hungerford. We've queried how that's whether the assessment criteria have been applied consistently on that southern boundary specifically. It was amended through consultation with the parish council. I appreciate that. But our main point, our basic point is that it's not following the basic premise that boundaries follow strong defensible boundaries, strong features on the ground. It doesn't in that part of south of Hungerford. So we would be seeking a modification of that.
So just to be clear, this is the part of the southern boundary at Hungerford.
That's it.
You don't think meets the criteria because it doesn't follow a strong feature on the ground.
The way it's been drawn and subsequently amended doesn't follow the criteria we would assert. So we would ask you to review that.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. Sorry. Cornwell.
Thank you, sir. I'm looking at Brimpton in particular. So there's an undeveloped parcel of land in the centre of the village, which is
suitable for development.
It's bound on most sides by development. So the criteria suggest that small-scale development opportunities, which would provide scope for infill and rounding off, would be included if they are physically, functionally, and visually related to the built-up area. And I set up in my statement that the parish council, when they were consulted on the boundary review, took the view that the site is within the built-up area and it has potential to be included in the settlement boundary, subject to a suitable scheme coming forward that the community was happy with.
Okay, thank you. Stantec.
Thanks, sir. One final point relates to the village of Yattenden. And we made representations on this. So the village of Yattenden settlement boundary is drawn quite tightly to the built settlement, as we discussed previously. But the points that we're querying are related to cricket pitch area, which area of recreation to the southeast of the village, and also an area known as the Withies, home farm cottages, Frosham business units. It's 21 dwellings, 14 commercial properties, employing up to 120 people at the minute. And in our view, should be considered part of the settlement boundary. Whether that is a continuous settlement boundary or, as the approach has been taken at Enbourne Row and Eastbury, whether it's two settlement boundaries and there's a slight gap in between.
So just to be clear, so that the Yattenden one, there's an area that's it's not contiguous with the boundary as drawn.
Yeah, so to the southeast of Yattenden village, there's an area referred to as, well, known as Frosham Home Farm. And the business units and the residential properties. It's not currently in the settlement boundary, but query whether it should be.
Okay, right, thank you. Do you want to make any brief comments on those? There's the Hungerford one, doesn't follow a strong feature on the ground to the south.
So we're happy. We responded to the town council. We very much, this was a community-led approach, and they came back and asked us that the boundary was drawn around the developable area of the site, rather than include the undeveloped area up to a hedge line to the south.
You satisfied it does meet the criteria?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Okay, I'll have a look. Brimpton one, you should include this area of open land because it's suitable for development. Does that meet the criteria?
Brimpton, again, again, following the community-led approach. So as part of the boundary review, the parish council did highlight this piece of land, and they commented that it could have potential, but they asked for it to be excluded until further work had been done, and they confirmed otherwise, and that's the approach that we have followed.
But suitability for development isn't in itself a criteria for inclusion, is it?
No, it's not.
It's outside the built for.
Yeah.
No.
So we have followed the criteria.
Okay. And the Yattenden, the area of this existing built-up area outside the boundary.
It is, yes, it's completely separate to the existing sort of built-up area, and it reads very much as part of the countryside. That's right. So the council's happy it's followed the criteria.
So can I just respond to a point that was just made, that suitability for the development is not part of the criteria? The final bullet point in the list of boundaries will include is single plots or other similar small scale development opportunities which would provide infill or rounding off opportunities.
Your argument is it would fall into it's well, not a single plot, but it would be a small scale development opportunity that would be infill and rounding off.
Yes, it would be infill because there's development on either side.
Okay. Would it, in your view, be infill?
In our view, it wouldn't be a small scale opportunity.
Provision.
Like you said, just to clarify then a response from the council, it seems then that the criteria for the settlement boundary reviews was set, but an extra possibility was the parish or town council coming up with a different approach. So just to clarify, that's the point. So it seems to be the council saying where the town and parish council suggest something outside of the local authority's criteria, they're allowed, that's accepted.
Okay, I think it was more where there's a sort of balanced judgment. It's not that they're using different criteria or simply doing what the parish council wanted. It was where there's a kind of, you could go one way, you could go the other, given that there are, you know, judgments to be made in applying these things. Is that what you're saying?
That's right, yes.
Okay. Thatcham Town Council, your nameplate's up? No. Okay. Well, I will have a, you know, I've got the points made. I can look again at the points in the Reg 19 reps and the written statements, and if necessary, I'll ask for any further clarification from the council on that. But it's one of these things. It's difficult to draw detailed boundaries in a examination process like this. It's and there have to be judgments made, and ultimately the local planning authority is responsible for making those judgments. So unless there's a very clear reason why I think that a mistake has been made, I think I'll tend to accept the local planning authority should be making the judgment. Okay. I think that deals with that issue about the settlement hierarchy, the strategic approach, and the settlement boundaries. So let's then move now on to, I said earlier, I think, and I'm going to stick to this, I'm going to move on to the site selection methodology. We've got 45 minutes, and I'd like to make sure we do finish that. If we don't then have time because of the cutoff of that we have today to deal with the other two things, which are about policy DM2, the specific policy, I will make sure we deal with that at another time, find a suitable time. And the other one that we potentially, if we don't have time to deal with, is the key diagram, which I don't think anyone's got very much to say about that hasn't already been said. So let's look at the site selection methodology again. I mean, to some extent, we've been through this. But basically, the plan, paragraph 6.22, says that the approach to making new allocations was based on the spatial strategy, the settlement hierarchy, which we've discussed, and consideration of the availability, suitability and viability of the sites that have been put forward through the housing and economic land availability assessment. So that's what we've been discussing a lot of that already. So I'm just going to, if I could, just go through sort of chronologically what I think is what happened, and you can tell me if I'm right or wrong. So there was a call for sites in December 2016 to March 2017, and again in November, December 2018. Yeah,
that's correct.
And that led to around, doesn't matter precisely, around 300 sites being put forward. Yeah,
right. Yes.
So that was the start. So then they were assessed under in the housing and the HELA in February and December 2020.
That's right.
So was that two separate publications?
It was. So the very first HELA to be published was in February 2020, and then we published one later that year because we carried out like a fact-checking exercise. So we told people if they, you know, they had any, if we'd made any factual inaccuracies to let us know, and then we could correct it. So that was that second published version towards the end of 2020.
Okay, but then there was another HELA process in January 2023.
That's right. So we then published an updated version in January 23, and that we had through the Regulation 18 consultation, we had sites promoted through that, and so that considered those. We also had some people coming back to us saying they wanted us to consider revised use for the site, or a reduced site area or enlarged site area.
So the sustainability report, 2022 report, it says that the HELA assessed 249 sites as potential housing allocations. So is that 249 out of the 300?
It was, yes.
So the other 50 or so were for other uses. So there's nothing different about that. It's just reporting back in the essay. Okay. So then the essay report says that 165 of the 249 were considered to be not developable in 15 years. So that was not an assessment that the SA did. It's reporting back again what the HELA had found based on those discussions you'd had with the site promoters and your evidence, etc. Okay,
That's right.
so that was based on the HELA of December 2020. Yeah, okay. So 165 of the 249 were considered to be not developable. So that left around 80 that were still there potentially to look at further. Okay. Okay. Then I don't know where this came in, but the SA report also says that a number of factors meant that you didn't. Sorry. So the SA report also says the number of factors also ruled out sites for being included as allocations. And these are for, well, one within settlement boundaries. So you didn't need those. So that may have, so some of the HELA ones that have been put forward, you decided, well, we don't need to allocate that.
Because we thought again that presumption in favour of sustainable development,
Right.
so we didn't need to allocate.
Okay. You also ruled out ones that were detached from settlement boundaries.
That's right, because effectively those are in open countryside, so
Yeah.
they fall below the settlement hierarchy.
Yeah. So this was strategic decisions you made, irrespective of what the site was like or how close it was to a settlement. It was basically a line was drawn, okay? And then, or if they were at a settlement outside the hierarchy.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. And finally, you wouldn't make an allocation if there was a neighbourhood plan being prepared that was intending to make allocations itself.
That's right, yes.
Okay, so they're the four. So that meant some filtered out. Of the 80 that had been looked at, did that remove some of the 80 then, those four?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So then the so the interim sustainability appraisal report going back to December 2020, this may have gone back the wrong way, says that 50 were considered as potential for allocations. Is that the 50 out of the 80, or is this a different time?
It was then refined down in the January 23 ESA.
It was.
Yes.
So there were around 50 that were considered as potential in the Reg 18 stage. Yep, okay, so that's what we've got to. Then we jump forward to the SA report 2022 that says that 16 are taken forward as reasonable alternatives for potential allocation in the Reg 19 plan. Although there seem to be 18 that were assessed in Appendix 8B. I think this may be where the retained allocations have been moved across to another process in the SA.
So at Reg 18,
Yeah.
the 50 sites included the retained
Yeah.
allocations, whereas the updated version doesn't. They have then been split out. So they were included. That's why they're included.
Okay.
Why that number's higher.
And was it 16 or 18?
We'll need to check.
Yeah, okay. But either way, but when you got to the SA report in 2022, the assessment, you'd got down to 16 or 18. Okay. So what had happened to the other 30 or so?
So those are the ones that have been ruled out.
So they're listed in the appendix,
list.
and you can look at the reasons why they.
Yeah.
So on further assessment, they've been then taken out. Okay. Okay. So there are. So we talk about the retained ones and the process for those. And the 9 new allocations in the plan, they were the ones that were assessed as being, all of the ones that were assessed as being suitable out of the 16 or 18. And that's the list you were just talking about. There you can see the ones that were excluded and the reasons that they were. Okay, fine. So that's the factual, that's what happened. We've had discussions about, you know, the spatial strategy and this approach of ruling ones out that are separate and different places in the hierarchy. So I think I'll just let people question that. The whole issue of the landscape assessment, which has been raised several times, again, that was quite a key consideration. And again, it's summarised in the HELA based on the evidence that can be found listed in the LAN section of the, yeah. Okay, so that seems to be where the one biggest areas of dispute is. We've talked about the approach that you took and the bar that was set and how clear it was and how consistent it was. So I understand. Okay, right. I think, so is there anything more you want to say to explain the process,
nothing further, no.
the mechanics of it and the factors? Right, okay. Anything anybody else wishes to say about that? I know we've covered it in some ways already today, but another chance to, in that context of what I've just found out. I mean, you probably understood all that anyway, but yeah, when you're reading lots of documents, it's sometimes a bit difficult to follow exactly what went on.
Thank you, sir. I won't repeat the fundamental argument. You know, my site is in Thatcham, it's CA12. CA12 isn't a strategic site, and it was discounted despite the fact that it's in the highest order settlement. It was discounted at an early stage because it wasn't a strategic site. The council had no consideration of whether a strategic site, North East Thatcham, could be developed in concert with a smaller allocation, which, as I said earlier, would deliver short term and would deliver benefits to Thatcham in concert with a larger strategic site. It simply wasn't considered during the sustainability process. It was discounted because it wasn't strategic. And I think that's flawed, given the fact that the council is putting a lot of emphasis on its settlement hierarchy, and Thatcham is the focus for growth. It's going to be a focus for growth probably in 10 years' time when North East Thatcham starts to come out of the ground, sir. Thatcham needs development now to deliver housing and affordable housing and support for the town centre.
Yeah, I mean, we don't need to reiterate the benefits of development in certain locations, because I think we've dealt with that at great length. I understand the arguments for why there should be more in different places, different arguments for different reasons. But I think what I'm interested in here is if you think clearly that this methodology that has just been outlined has been misapplied. I think that's what I'm interested in at this particular point of this consideration. And I think what you're saying about that site is that it was misapplied.
Well, I think there are two elements, sir. Firstly, it was simply discounted, even though the site in the Helar was it was appropriate for development. It was discounted because it wasn't a strategic site. So they didn't look at having allocations in Thatcham, despite the fact of its settlement hierarchy. The other issue, which I raised yesterday, was that when the decision was made to allocate growth at Thatcham, it was originally in the Reg 18. When our site was taken out, it was 2,500 houses. It was a much larger development. And when the council changed the strategy at Thatcham, they didn't go back and have a look at what alternative options they could deliver for Thatcham in terms of a smaller strategic site and an allocation.
Yeah, I've got all that. Yeah, thank you. Opus, I'll deal with you before I go around further.
It's fine. It's about the methodology and what it's seeking to achieve. In terms of Newbury and Crookham Golf Club, there were two sites put into the Helar. One was the golf club. So what would happen there is trying to put the clubhouse forward. And the other was a residential development. Now, the driver of that residential development wasn't the housing per se, it was the finance that would come from that, which in terms would allow the golf course to sustain itself, to protect itself, and to enhance itself. And alongside that, you have the health and well-being benefits, you have the employment benefits, you have the community benefits that lie with that, you have the green infrastructure benefits that sit with that, because this is a 100-acre site, but not if that golf club goes bust, because it can't afford to continue. And in the site selection methodology, nothing relating to what the purpose of that housing development was applied to the consideration. It was just simply, it was a residential development.
So yeah, I suppose the point and the methodology is that there could have been or there should have been another criteria that looked at on a case-by-case basis, balancing the benefits against the other criteria.
Yeah, it's looking at the strategic objectives of the SA and what it's trying to achieve, and it's not just housing. There's a number of issues relating, as I say, to biodiversity, health and well-being, leisure, etc., etc.
Okay, thank you. Understood. Town, before I move on round.
So I just want to say two things. Vis-a-vis the methodology and the point you made about landscaping, you will recall that so far as my site is concerned, when you look at the Helar, it was judged to be suitable, achievable, deliverable but it was members' concerns. You'll see this specifically when you look at the HELAR and Till 13. And I was, again, as you will remember, I was one of those 16 sites in 8B. And one of the things I just want to make clear to you is that in the landscape assessment, so the site was part of a larger site that was looked at. I'm going to give you the reference in LAN 5D, page 9, and the site was known as Pinson's Hill EUA 007. It was a larger site than the site that is now being promoted. So I just want to draw that to your attention and reiterate that we weren't excluded for any of the reasons that form part of the site assessment methodology. It was for what was really a rogue judgment of, it seems, members. So they didn't actually apply the rules properly to us, is the point.
Yeah, understood. Thank you. Turley.
Thank you, sir. I won't labour the point, and Ms Cook has a similar predicament with her site as we have with ours, that, as I alluded to earlier, we were assessed with a number of other sites. And again, I don't want to go back to tables 11 and 12 of the essay, page 50, as I referred to earlier, but just draw your attention as well, sir, to page 25 of the essay. And that has a clear statement here in terms of how the subsequent assessment of sites occurred. There's a line here, sir, that says, following the decision that the spatial strategy should focus on Thatcham, strategic site options were considered based on the sites submitted. Then you had these five groups of sites, and none of them were assessed by themselves. And it was almost like you had to show that you were a massive site before you could disaggregate the sites. And our point has always been that our client site is more than capable of coming forward on its own. And particularly some of the choices that were made. One of the options, option 5 of this SA process, was to combine the Northeast Thatcham sites with the Hennick sites, which include my client site. There's no functional or geographic relationship between those sites, sir. It's really quite a curious part of the SA. So again, there are sites that have merit that are not properly assessed through the SA and site selection process.
And the reason they weren't properly assessed in terms of the specific site that you now have in mind was because that's when they were put forward either originally by the site promoter, or because they were larger, or because they adjoined another area that was being put forward separately by another promoter, and the way the council went about it, they grouped them. Is that?
That's effectively it. So each of those 5 options have, I think all of them actually have 5 different HELAR sites that have been bundled together and then scored down together, which is a slightly curious way of dealing with this.
And then not reassessed on their own, individually, separately.
Or set aside before you get to that stage.
Understood. Okay, yep. Sorry, provision.
Thank you, sir. So this is in relation to Aldermaston Wharf. So in the site selection methodology paper, it said that sites in assessments below the hierarchy were ruled out from further consideration. Aldermaston Wharf is currently a service village, but in this local plan is downgraded to a small settlement. And that's a concern for us, because despite having a range of existing facilities as recognised in the topic paper and scoring highly and comparable with other service villages. It has schools, it has a train station, it has a mobile library service, shops, etc. It provides facilities that support, in line with the NPPF, other villages nearby. And our concern is that if it is downgraded and there is no further development opportunities that can come forward, that will harm that community in a social economic way.
Okay, so that's a point about the settlement hierarchy and or the application of the methodology to making allocations outside the settlement hierarchy.
Yeah, it kind of overlaps between the two points, and it's yeah.
Okay, Bucklebury Parish Council.
Thank you, sir. It's just following on from the point that Mr. Burden had made to you. Just in the sustainability appraisal, sorry, I had the reference a minute ago and now it's gone. Bear with me. It's on, I think, page 29, and it talks about the site selection process in relation to the Thatcham growth study. And it says within that it talks about the Thatcham growth study being commissioned to deliver strategic development. It says, while all sites in Thatcham have been considered the only sites, brackets in combination with each other, that are considered suitable for strategic level of development are the group of sites located in North East Thatcham. It's a bit confusing on that language. But then it says no other alternatives have been considered, as there are no other sites or group of sites within Thatcham that would be able to deliver the scale of development required to support the additional infrastructure required. And I think we've heard from some other representatives here that there are other sites. And I think it's just how then that Thatcham growth study fed into the site selection methodology. And for me, I'm not clear of what the order was there and at what point in the site selection process did that come into play. And I think that's really important that we understand that from the council, because that's not clear to me.
Okay, thank you. Hallam, land management.
Thank you. So I saved this point right till the very end because it's a small point, but you referred, sir, to the landscape documents being in the land series in the examination. I referred earlier, sir, to the Mortimer landscape capacity assessment that was undertaken, which is then carried into the HELA and is the cornerstone of the assessment that occurs for those sites in Mortimer. I've just checked with Ms. Bassett earlier. That document isn't part of the land series. It comes much earlier in the sequence, but is nevertheless the thing that was intrinsic in the conclusion drawn.
I think did you give me the reference earlier? But have you got it now? And I'll make it up. Or is it not there at all?
It's not there at all.
Right. Okay.
It's in the online evidence base, not in the examination library.
That's referred that what the HELA concludes on that is based on that. That's the point you're making. Not the more. Yeah.
Yeah.
Understood. Yeah. Thank you. Okay. Right. Do you want to deal with some of the points? And I suppose particularly this issue about where assessments were done based on the call for sites when they were as a group. And then was there an overlooking of looking again at in smaller, individual sites? Was that done or was it not done?
I think partly so. We covered that yesterday, but in particular for the North East Thatcham and general Thatcham growth, we were looking for strategic level development and we were looking at options to deliver that, which could have included groups of sites coming together. The North East Thatcham site on its own had already got together as a group, and that HELA references THA 20. So that was assessed in two different things individually and then as a group, and we took it forward as a group for that option. The Colthrop group, again, it's a group of sites that was located close together that could have been considered for strategic level development. Again, that's kind of the approach that was taken. And because we wanted strategic level development in Thatcham, we didn't then go and look at smaller sites in Thatcham separately to that sort of spatial strategy for a strategic site in Thatcham.
It's correct to say once you decided that the solution for Thatcham was a strategic site and North East Thatcham was the one that would deliver the infrastructure and be the scale that was necessary. So are you then saying that even if there were other suitable available sites at Thatcham, you wouldn't allocate them because they weren't needed?
That's correct, yes.
Okay, so right. So I'm sorry, I probably had gathered this before and I've probably been around so many things that I've lost track of it. But there aren't any suitable available sites other than at Thatcham where they're not needed.
I think the other sites in Thatcham, but it's my understanding that the sites that are considered to be suitable in Thatcham are the ones that have been taken forward. We are aware there are other sites, and the Thatcham growth study does talk about the site at Hennick being an opportunity for growth in the future. But that we weren't looking to take forward more development in Thatcham, and the reduction in the site number on North East Thatcham was in response to the number of comments about development in Thatcham. So we didn't consider it be reasonable to then look at another site in Thatcham to sort of make up the numbers, as it were, because we were reducing it in response to comments made as part of the Reg 18 consultation.
So once you decided, just to be clear about the process, so either you know that there are other suitable available sites at Thatcham, or you're not sure because once you decided on which the strategic site should be, you then moved the others aside saying we don't need them. So the Hennick collection and the Colthorpe collection.
Where some suitable sites, but we decided we're looking at a strategic option to deliver the infrastructure.
Okay, thank you. Right.
I'm struggling. I mean, there's a number of phrases going around. There's strategic growth and there's strategic site. Thatcham was identified for strategic growth, and that was it. The council chose to go for a strategic site, and then they said they didn't take our site forward because it wasn't needed. This is the 2,500 strategic site, of course, which they originally looked at, and another site wasn't needed. Then they reduce by 1,000 houses the strategic site, and they say, well, our site's not needed still. I don't understand it, sir. The only reason they're doing that is because of the clear political implications and the community concerns about that level of. It's not good planning, sir. It's knee-jerk reaction.
Sorry, leave it with me. I understand. I've got to the bottom of what I think I probably knew already, but there is this issue about the council's assessment of the sites and it having a reason in that it thinks based on landscape a lot that aren't suitable, and there's dispute about those. But there is another category, I think, at Thatcham where either they were not assessed individually because they were considered not to be needed, or they were assessed and they were found to be suitable and available, but they were not allocated because they were not needed. So it's slightly different from elsewhere. So I think I've got that point, and so leave it with me, please. Right, Thatcham Town Council.
Sorry, sir, just coming back on that point.
Yeah.
From my perspective, I'm clear from what I've heard today that the council decided that they were going to allocate North East Thatcham and then looked at other sites. That's what I've heard from what the council, getting nods from this side of the room. So there was a decision made. So it wasn't that there was kind of two things going on. There was a sequence in which decision making was made on site allocations. And it's very important that you have that in your notes in terms of the way that this came about, because that's a fundamental problem with this plan.
Well, in terms of the Thatcham, the decision to go for a strategic site and it being North East Thatcham.
Yeah, if a decision was made already that they were definitely going to go with North East Thatcham,
okay,
and then discounted other sites after that decision was made,
yeah,
to me that's a wrong way to make that decision.
Okay.
In looking at the site selection process of your question now, the soundness of that approach from what we've heard is not sound.
Okay, understood. Town Council.
Thank you, sir. So to follow on from Mr. Black, I attended the sole workshop as part of the Thatcham Strategic Growth Study at an early stage. We've already made representations about both the inadequacies of that study and the way that it was, that workshop and the way it was misrepresented. But the key point I wish to make is by that point, there was an absolute decision that the study would be focusing on North East Thatcham. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I've got the point about the decision of the council to go for North East Thatcham and the growth study, etc., and the Berkshire Vision 2050. We'll come back to it specific to North East Thatcham, but I understand the points you're making and the points that others are making about what the implications were of that decision for other allocations or other options around that. Yes, Litchfields.
Yeah, I think my question's been answered by what you just said, that I think we're at risk of going down a Thatcham wormhole at 4:30 on a.
Yeah.
So I think as long as some of those issues can be wrapped up into the matter for session, because in a sense the answer to the conundrum that's being posited is either, I guess, around no other sites or other sites, but obviously one of the other questions is the site as originally proposed by the council. So it seems to me matter 4 is the sort of forum for debating that more thoroughly. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Right. I don't think I've got any other questions on this unless there's anything else the council wishes to say. So we may as well look at, well, I'll give you a choice. We can either look at the settlement gap policy DM2, which was on the agenda for today, or it's hot and everyone is tired. We may not do it justice. I don't think it'll take a particularly long time, but I'm happy also to slot that in somewhere else. The council, presumably you don't mind one way or the other? No, other than exhaustion. Would it cause a problem for anyone else if that were? There's a number of you have made comments about this, and some of them are a matter of principle and some of them are site specific. Yeah. Bell Cornwall first.
Sorry, I'm just saying I do need to participate. I'm not due back here on any other days, but I'm happy to come back on another occasion.
Okay, Mr. Hamilton.
Yes, I'm here for the gap policy, and that's the only thing I'm here for. So I'd like to, if we could do it.
Yeah,
today,
no,
that'd
fine.
be great.
Okay, no, that's reason. Okay, right. It would be good to get it done. So just let's just deal with it. So there's a specific policy in the plan to prevent the coalescence of Newbury and Thatcham and to maintain the separate identity of the distinct settlements around both towns. And then the policy sets out the development would detract from the open or rural character of 5 gaps between settlements, and they're defined on the map, will not be permitted. And then there's also some criteria relating to physical separation. So, and the settlements are named, and as I say, the gaps are defined. So the first basic point is why is this needed when you've got other policies that deal with development in the countryside, etc. Why do you need this more specific approach in this location?
So it's a policy that's been developed in response to the long-standing and genuine community concerns that have been raised about the coalescence of settlements and the loss of their individual identity around Newbury and Thatcham, where the risk of coalescence is greatest. The LPR notes that the separate and distinctive identity of these individual settlements helps to define the communities, and it's an important feature of the character of West Berkshire. It's a long-standing objective for the council, recognised in the existing core strategy and simply carried forward into the LPR. The policy will help ensure that that objective is delivered. It also highlights the importance that the council should be given to the issue. And it's clear from the Reg 19 responses that there's general support for the principle of the policy. It's just specific circumstances where representatives have concerns.
But the question was, why is it needed when you've got policies SP1, DM1, DM35, etc., and other policies relating to development in the countryside?
It's, as I say, it's highlighting the specific issue around Newbury and Thatcham, and the policy is performing a different role to the other policies in the plan.
Does it have any different effect than the other policies? Okay, put it this way. Is it intended to prevent developments that would otherwise be allowed in the countryside that are allowed by some of the other DM policies as an exception to the general preclusion of development in the countryside? So things like rural exception housing sites, for example, it would rule that out, would it, in this particular location? Is that the purpose?
It's not a blanket policy. So it's not saying that all development couldn't take place. It just gives greater certainty to the type of development that would be acceptable. So it doesn't seek to prevent development or open land uses that would otherwise be suitable in a countryside location.
But DM35 is about rural economic development. DM1 is about rural exception housing sites. They meet certain criteria. Is this intended to apply stricter criteria for those sorts of proposals because of the coalescence issue?
In essence, with those particular areas, yes.
So notwithstanding the fact that DM1 and DM35, for example, and there may be other DM policies relating to development in the countryside, they have requirements regarding safeguarding the character and appearance of the area. So that those factors would come in. Irrespective of that, you still want to have this clearer, more specific approach to restrict development in these particular areas.
Yes, as I say, it's highlighting a particular issue that we have.
Yeah, no, that's not a reason for having a policy highlighting an issue. It's the effectiveness of the policy and why it's needed. Okay, so I won't try and identify other development policies that allow development in the countryside, but the same principle applies. You may meet some of the criteria of other DM policies, but this is adding an extra tier because of the importance of the openness of that area. Okay. It includes a hospital, I noticed. I'm looking at the map.
It does, yes.
So would that restrict development of the hospital? I mean, it's not been raised as a representation by the NHS or the hospital, but is that not an issue, or?
I don't know at the moment, potentially, yes.
It would restrict even for something like a
Yes, it
hospital.
would certainly have to be taken into consideration, yes, but obviously each case is dealt with on its own merits.
So in effect, it's a green belt type policy under different terminology.
No, it's not. It's not saying that no development, it's saying certain types of development. It's just being specific.
Well, it doesn't say certain types of development. It's development that meets certain criteria, isn't it?
Yes, sorry, that was a poor choice of words.
Yeah. So anything that would detract from the open or rural character, openness of the 5 gaps will not be permitted, not even in exceptional circumstances or very special circumstances. Okay, understood. Right. Mr. Hamilton.
It's actually Mr. Bailey.
Sorry.
I'm from RPS. I'm representing.
RPS,
Mr.
okay, sorry.
Yeah, some of the questions you're asking there were sort of along the lines that I've been thinking. I mean, basically, a strategic gap policy is very similar to greenbelt policy in that it isn't seeking to have an environmental constraint. It's basically a policy constraint, the same as greenbelt. So this is tantamount to a greenbelt between Newbury and Thatcham. And as I said in my regulation 19 reps, I feel that it's just another layer of constraint that is unnecessary because, as you mentioned earlier, there are already a number of policies that protect the countryside from inappropriate development. So why do we need yet another layer of constraint? And the council has said that the NPPF supports the designation of strategic gaps, and it refers to paragraph 130 of the NPPF, which is now 135 since it's been amended. And that talks in section D about establishing and maintaining a strong sense of place. And it talks about how development should establish a strong sense of place. It doesn't talk about strategic gaps. So there's actually nothing in the NPPF that supports the use of strategic gaps in local plans. And that was the sort of main point that I wanted to make.
Okay, understood, thanks. Yes, I mean, I agree. I don't think there's anything in the NPF that's specifically saying, strategic gap policies. Bell Cornwell.
Thank you. I'm more interested in the other gap between the south of Newbury and Inbourne Row, which is it's considered a rural hamlet to the south of Newbury, and my client's site is in that proposed gap in the northern section. I would agree this is a greenbelt policy in effect, and it's actually more restrictive than greenbelt policy because it doesn't allow for infilling in villages or PDL redevelopment and so on. Given the district is so constrained, as we've heard, this effectively will be creating a belt around Newbury to prevent expansion in the few directions where you could naturally see some expansion that's not into the AO and B. So in terms of the justification, as you say, this is not a landscape policy, it's not a ecology or tree protection policy. This is about prevention of coalescence and protection of identity. And I've not seen any evidence describing what the identity of those settlements is. The landscape area assessments are over huge areas. So in the area in the south in particular, I've pointed you in the statement to Watermill Bridge. The identity of that settlement will inevitably change with the development of 270 houses adjacent. The inspector has already said in that appeal that that area already functions as a suburb of Newbury. So even though there is a settlement.
I've read the statement. I understand the point, the site-specific point. So
yeah,
we've got limited time and there's several people. So can we give everyone?
So in summary, we've got landscape evidence before us, but we don't have any evidence to suggest that there's a particular identity of these settlements which requires protection to prevent coalescence.
Provision.
Thank you. The council in their response to you on this matter at 1.68 said that in defining the extent of the gap, no more land than is necessary to prevent coalescence of the settlements has been included. So our client's site has been included. Between our client's site and Newbury is the River Kennet. And if you looked at this particular location on Google Maps or the council's maps, you'll see that's a pretty large body of water, which obviously is not going to be in itself developed. So what we can't understand is why our client's land, which is PDL land at the moment, has been included in that gap. I appreciate the time. So that's the particular point. I just encourage you to look at that and whether that particular site, it's Thatcham 2, Lower Way. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, Bucklebury.
It's a very quick one, sir, conscious of time, but our points really relate to para 9.13 of the supporting text on DM2. And it talks about why the parcel between Thatcham and Upper Bucklebury doesn't currently meet the designation for an essential gap. What it then says at the end of that sentence is that in accordance with the recommendations made in the appropriate countryside designation study, which is correct, the further assessment as to the appropriate essential gap in this area will need to be carried out when the extent of the built development on the site has been established. Now, you've now been presented with a modification that sets out, and this is Annex E, that does now set the developable area of that site. But what it does is it allocates the land around it as green infrastructure buffer. Now, that doesn't actually carry any designations within the plan and doesn't speak to any other policy apart from green infrastructure, which is a wider policy. So given that the council has now, we say, set the extent of built development, is the council now saying that that is going to be green gap in accordance with DM2, or effectively that will be identified as such? And if not, then why?
Okay, understood. We'll come back to that when we look at the North East Thatcham again, but also specifically where the implications of where the settlement boundary has been drawn and where the development area has been defined and what would happen to the land, as you say, designated as green buffer or whatever it is, and the policy that relates to that. So thank you. Very quickly, please, because we've got to give everyone a last opportunity in 2 minutes.
I agree with Bucklebury Parish Council relating to that gap, but I'll focus on the one between Thatcham and Newbury. I think just about all of that site, all of that, the area identified has been the subject of investigations, if proposals for development, for settlement, or for other applications. So without special measures, I think that it would inevitably get filled. I draw your attention to NPPF paragraphs 16, 20 and 79, and particularly 16 relates to the views of local people, and Thatcham strongly supports this. Just to mention that the applications have included a site originally for 43 holiday chalets, purporting to be holiday chalets, but in construction indistinguishable from residences around Thatcham Lake, a garage, housing development, light industrial. So we think that without some sort of special emphasis, and also I should say that a site immediately adjacent to the boundary with Newbury was claimed to be suitable for rural economic development, even though according to the ONS categorization, it is urban. So I think that this policy fulfills a very important need for the communities. Thank you.
Okay, I got the point. Thank you. Cladman.
Thank you, sir. I'll keep it brief, sorry. I'd just like to come back to your point about need to begin with and why there's a need for this policy. In the appropriate countryside designation document, which the council rely on, they state in there that the current policy CS19 and the future wording for policy PL18 will do the job sufficiently in terms of preventive coalescence. And therefore, it doesn't seem like there's a requirement for this policy to be included as well.
Okay, thank you.
That's page 69 in that document. There's no paragraph numbers, I'm afraid.
Okay, okay, page 69. Thank you. All right.
And then just moving on quickly, very briefly again, sorry, on there was a mention by the council that the community have wanted these gaps putting in place. We chimed up because we know that there's a desire from Newbury Town Council for a fifth access into Sandalford Park onto Andover Road, and the only way for that to be delivered would be through that strategic gap at Newbury Common.
Yeah, I got that point. I mean, I suppose if that became something that was a definite proposal, and it would have to be through some sort of review, wouldn't it? Of the process. Okay, but I understand the point. I mean, well, yeah, okay, thank you. We'll just let's opus work and then.
I'll keep this very short. It was just coming back to the layers of policy and whether this is actually necessary. As I noted before, in terms of Newbury and Crookham Golf Club, that is a significant area of land that sits between Newbury and Thatcham, and which the future of depends on residential development coming forward and that clubhouse being uplifted along with the course. Now, this policy would essentially preclude that residential coming forward, and therefore actually fundamentally undermine the ability of Newbury and Crookham to continue as a concern. So it's very important that you don't have these broad brush red line policies that put in place. You need some flexibility within them, as we heard in terms of Thatcham Community Hospital as well.
Yeah, okay. Right, anything else? I think I've got the council's. I've need
just respond to that. Unfortunately, the policies map is not available online at the moment, but I believe that this area is quite focused north of the Kennet, and doesn't affect the gap at the Crookham Golf Course at all. Thank you. Which is of course Greenham anyway.
Okay. Anything else the council wishes to say on the M2? I think I've understood that it's deliberately intended to be an extra restriction, and it's necessary in the council's view because it would prevent some forms of development that may otherwise be allowed by the DM policies in the plan, but it also adds another reason why development may be refused in that area for strategic reasons, not for landscape or biodiversity or whatever, but for a judgment about the importance of keeping these settlements separate. So I think that's it. Right, good. So I think we will finish there for today. Nobody made any comments about the key diagram in written statements, apart from town and the, was it support for the inclusion of the, sorry?
Yes, so we supported the inclusion of a key diagram in the plan.
Yes, okay. So let's end on a positive note that we've dealt with the key diagram and we've got positive support for it. So thank you all for your contributions today. Unless there's any procedural questions or points that people wish to make, we can pack up quickly if you could, I think. Well, I think the people will be coming in to grab your microphone. So we'll end there. We're now going to break. We're not coming back next week. We're back the week after, if my memory serves me right, on the Tuesday. So look forward to that. So thank you again for the contributions today, and we've done well to get through the agenda. So good. Thank you.